Hello and welcome to one more edition of Off the Cuff, or OTC. Our guest today is Arvind Subramanian, I have to get it right, Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, but more importantly, a globally reputed economist, public intellectual, commentator. I've been reading his articles for a very long time in the most reputed publications of the world. Somebody who's taken seriously around the world. And he's been the person behind some of the new resolutions which have been arrived at. The topmost on the list being goods and services tax. So Arvind, wonderful to have you in front of this great audience who all have questions for you. And you have all the answers. Now, because I felt intellectually challenged holding a conversation with Arvind, particularly in front of all these guys. This is not a Delhi audience that I can, on subjects of economy, I can talk about politics, so I have to talk economics. I sought third-party intervention. So we have Adi Godrej, who everybody knows. And Adi, if I remember correctly, you invented that line that GST will add 2% to India's GDP.
Well, I still believe it, absolutely. Of course, it depends on how it is finally formulated. But it is certainly, to my mind, it will be the greatest reform since the 91 changes we saw.
So, Arvind, you think it is the greatest reform since 1991? And unlike 91, this is really so bipartisan.
Yeah, I think that, all of us have this tendency perhaps to succumb to hype and hyperbole. But I do think that in many ways, this is really a major reform, potentially game-changing, and in a number of ways. I think first and foremost, of course, is that, if you just think about the complexity of India, and 29 states, 2 union territories, you have to do a constitutional amendment bill, you're going to affect, 8-9 lakh tax-paying entities, you have to forge a consensus, widely divergent interests, from some who believe there should be complete fiscal autonomy for the states, to others who want more harmonization. And, to pull it off finally with near unanimity, I think just is very special. The second thing, I think in ways it's very, very special and new and daring, is actually we've embarked on an experiment in kind of what I would call the political governance of cooperative federalism. Think about it. Going forward, what you're going to have is the states and the center sitting together, day after day, sorting out these complicated tax issues. And so, you have to, when you think about cooperative federalism at work, I think this is going to be something very, very bold, new, and of course, experimental in some ways. But I do also want to, put in your mind the thought that, if you look globally, for example, democracies around the world, or I should say even democracies around the world, are being buffeted by the forces of, nativism, populism, isolationism. And at that conjuncture in history, to have pulled what we've done, risen above, incivility, acrimony, discord, and pull this off is just, you're just so absolutely proud to be an Indian and part of this process. So I think at least for some time we should shed our cynicism and stuff and just reflect on something really big that, the body politic has managed to achieve.
In fact, they've sort of vindicated the democratic system in a way.
Yeah, that and also on a more kind of temporary level, if you followed the debate both in the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha, I mean, the quality and maturity of debate was just something exceptional. And, I was there, following this. And, on all sides, the finance minister, the opposition, so many other interventions, really high quality. And it was really a very, very enriching experience to be part of that.
Adi, want to take it forward?
Arvind, what do you think will and should be, I know what you think should be, the standard rate, because I think the effectiveness of this legislation will depend a lot on having a reasonable standard rate of tax.
Yeah, so I think that, I don't know for good or bad reasons, this has become somewhat the focus of all the discussions that have happened so far. You know, we wrote a report, a committee headed by me wrote a report which said that the standard rate, the revenue neutral rate should be between 15 and 15.5%, and that the standard rate, which means the rate that would apply on most goods and services, should be between 17 and 19%, and of course, depending on certain assumptions. I think that, you know, it's critical what those assumptions are, and many of them are actually policy choices that the GST Council will have to make. You know, one example, if there's going to be compensation for the states, where should that money come from? Should that come from the GST itself, or should that come from elsewhere in the budget? I mean, that's one decision. Going to roll all the cesses that have been implemented into the GST. You know, how should they be done, when, and what should the phasing be? But I think from what everyone is going to be struggling now is, I think, to reconcile 2 or 3 objectives. On the one hand, we want taxes to be relatively low because inflation, the impact on prices, especially for the common man, is a politically really very important issue. On that side of the ledger, you have, you know, the fact that the higher the tax rate, the more difficult compliance becomes. No question about that. Evidence all around the world. So you have to reconcile these 2 objectives with the other objective, which is, you know, absolutely important, which is you want to maintain a certain level of revenue, because after all, this is what governments want in order to be able to spend on a whole bunch of very important things, health, education, and so on. So I think you're going to have to reconcile these 3 objectives, and I think the challenge going forward is how is that going to be done?
But don't you think, Arvind, that there is not sufficient emphasis on the fact that with a tax like GST, evasion of indirect taxes becomes extremely difficult, especially with the strong IT system you all have put in place. And that itself could lead to considerable increased revenue.
Actually, that's a very good point. I think the beauty of the GST, it's what we call a value-added tax, to be technical, which is essentially that there is inbuilt compliance. Because, you know, agent A who buys from agent B has an incentive to, you know, ask agent B to produce the bills because he has to get tax credit on all that he's paid. So there's a self-policing system. And what really struck me, a statistic that I recently saw, is that the IT backbone that's being built up is such that, you know, at its peak, every month, between 3 and 5 billion invoices will be matched. That is, in my example, you know, agent A, what he says he's sold to B, and what B says he's bought from A, that will be matched, you know, digitally, real time, and as you quite rightly said, you will get this, you know, compliance. And knowing that, I think, knowing that that's going to happen, there will be a greater impact in terms of keeping proper accounts, keeping proper books. So I think the potential of this going forward is just enormous, which is why I think, and the finance minister has said this repeatedly, that over time, with these compliance benefits, you know, rates should start to, you know, come down over time as well.
Tremendous scope.
Yeah.
I don't know if sufficient thought has also been given to the fact that if indirect tax evasion comes down, for obvious reasons as you described, even direct tax evasion would come down very considerably.
Excellent point. I think this is one of the lesser highlighted facts.
Collateral benefits.
Absolutely. You know, you see, I think just to give a sense of that, see, at the moment, states have IT systems, not all of them, but many of them do. The center has an IT system. And, you know, the indirect tax IT system and the direct tax are all kind of, you know, fragmented. Going forward, all this, there will be a kind of central pool database. And so that, what Mr. Godrej said, that, of course, the indirect tax compliance, but then the center will be able to see, you know, okay, company A said it bought, you know, 700,000, you know, cars, for example, and then Does it match with what it reports as turnover in its income tax filing? And is there consistency between the two? I think the scope, therefore, to see this also as a, as an anti-black money initiative, except that without the kind of heavy-handed intervention of the government, because it's kind of automatically generated, there's self-policing. So in that sense, I think, it's kind of a major improvement in governance that it can potentially bring about.
I mean, this is your first experience working embedded in a government, right? Inside a government. Has it been a good experience? Have you regretted it sometimes?
See,
is it as bad as you had imagined, or is it better than you had imagined?
And I'll be completely honest, and I'm not exaggerating. I have a 24/7 high every day. It's just amazingly exciting job. Not a moment's regret. I've been surprised on the upside every day, in terms of the freedom, the scope to do things. The willingness of everyone to listen. I mean, a job of an advisor is to give advice. I mean, you shouldn't have the expectation that everything that you say is going to be acted upon, because nowhere in the world does it happen. But the ability to, analyze, talk to people, come up with ideas, put forward proposals, and have them heard, I mean, it's been absolutely a high, actually.
Do you feel that India could get into double-digit GDP growth for a few years? To my mind, with good monsoons predicted, especially with the La Nina effect in the Pacific, and the GST coming in together, it's quite possible that we could get into a double-digit GDP growth rate.
Yeah, I think just to put that in perspective, I think it's useful. 2 days ago, I tweeted something, which is that, I just, after the GST, I kind of just stepped back and said, if you look at the last 4 to 5 months, I would say there have been, at least from the policy side, we'll get into the economy in just a moment. From the policy side, there have been, I think, at least 4 potentially transformational, reforms / legislative achievements. We had the Aadhaar bill going through, which I think is going to provide a legal basis for a lot of, reform and rationalization of a lot of things in government, including subsidies. Then we've had the bankruptcy law, which is so important for, addressing what in the economic survey we called, the endemic problem of exit in Indian. We have a lot of entry now, but exit is proving very difficult. So the bankruptcy law.
For exit, you have to hide in London.
Well, that's one kind of exit. I think that, we want other kinds of exit. There, I guess we want re-entry, I think, as much as exit. The third thing we have is that, the monetary policy framework, which was kind of ad hoc and kind of going on, the government has again given it legislative basis after, consultations with the RBI. So whatever gains we've achieved on inflation, they're going to be now codified in law.
Because now there's a monetary committee.
There's
a target.
4 plus or minus 2%.
Yes, with the range, 4 to 6.
Yeah, exactly. So we've codified that 3, and then for the GST. So the other side of the macro policy framework is the fiscal side, and now we have this FRBM committee, which will then, provide an anchor for fiscal policy. I happen to be a member of that committee. So if you look at the policy side, I think this year you have to say that, really an impressive strides have been made, which kind of provide the basis for the question that Mr. Godrej asked, can we get to double-digit growth? I think, let's say we're at about 7.5 or whatever we are now. I think that we still face certain headwinds. I think, for example, the international economy is still quite down, although things have started to pick up, by the way. At least the decline in exports have bottomed out, and I think we see signs of it perking up, I think. So exports are still a challenge, and I think private investment is still a challenge. I think these are still headwinds, but I feel that with all these policy reforms, and if the world economy turns around a little bit more, getting to or approaching double-digit growth should be within reach for this. When that will happen, this year, 2 years from now, are kind of open questions. But I think it's certainly doable.
There's been a growth phobia in the country, in the sense that if you're growing so fast, that means you don't have the structure for growing this fast, so something will begin to rattle, or this will create inequalities too fast. Some people will get left behind and there'll be rebellions. So there is a suspicion of high growth years in India.
I'm surprised you say that. And let me just offer two remarks. One is that, you know, all the historical experience has been, all the East Asians, including China, that, you know, when you grow at or close to double digit, I mean, the transformation that takes place is just spectacular. I mean, it's undeniable. Second point, I think, is that people don't realize that, you know, it is intrinsic to such rapid growth that, you know, there is no country in the history of humanity that grows at 10% for 20 years in a kind of smooth fashion. You know, rapid growth means disruption, change, dislocation, you know, financial fragilities building up, you know, and maybe some other pathologies as well. But that's intrinsic to the business. So, but we can't be fearful of that, and therefore, you know, not aim for the double-digit growth, I think.
Adi, you deal with the Indian consumer at cutting edge end. Every village in the country, wherever you go, you find his goods selling. What sense are you getting? Are you getting Achhe Din sense yet or not?
I think just about. We have seen some of it in July and August, once the monsoon has turned positive. And I think we could have got it earlier except for the bad monsoon. And so rural demand was affected. But now, what is very good news is there is a likelihood of 4 good monsoons, because as I mentioned earlier, the La Nina effect in the Pacific Ocean. There's a good probability of that. Of course, you can't be absolutely sure. And to my mind, with the GST coming in and giving a boost, it's quite possible. I'm quite optimistic.
I think the one thing we should guard against in all this is that, you know, there is no one measure that can be a panacea for, you know, growth or whatever, you know. Governments and policymakers have to do a whole bunch of things. And it's the cumulative effect of these things that, you know, gets you sustainedly a high growth rate. So while, you know, there can be no bigger fan of the GST than me, but, you know, to think that, you know, the GST on its own will somehow change India is not something that we should, you know, we shouldn't fall into that kind of trap either.
If I can switch subject a little bit.
I knew you were going to.
You are a professional economist, right? Academic, commentator, public intellectual. Do politicians get it when you tell them economics?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, you know, the notion that somehow, you know, remember that it's a good question to ask, Shekhar, at a time when the global reaction to elites and pundits has been so resounding, you know, after all, you know, Brexit, et cetera, So I think, you know, academics, intellectuals need to be a lot more humble, I think. What I think is important is to try and you know, I think all of us as economists, you know, we do the analysis, but I think the art of persuasion, I think, is, you know, is a lot more challenging. Because I think the fundamental thing is, for us, is how do you make good economics, good politics? Right?
Yes, because, you know, what works for politicians is not GDP itna jayega,
exactly,
tax itna jayega, fiscal deficit itna jayega, balance of trade. What works for them is all of this will translate into this many votes.
Yeah, but Shekhar, I think, well, I disagree a little bit, because then you have to say, well, what is it that will get you these many votes? I mean, some will say, you know, you spend on these schemes, you'll get the votes. Some will say, you know, you reduce inflation, you'll get these votes. But I think the challenge for us is to say that if you can create general dynamism in the economy, that will get you a lot of votes. I think making that case, I think, is the most challenging one. But I think Indian experience, I think, I know that you're going to tell me one counterexample, but, you know, we'll leave that. But generally, if you look at the last 2 to 3 election cycles in India at the center and the states, not always, not all the time, but broadly, delivery in terms of governance and growth and low inflation have been rewarded in the polls, by and large. And I think that, is the dynamic we need to build on going forward in convincing politicians that good economics is good politics.
You said politicians get economics. If that is the case, why have relations between North Bloc and the government and the central banker chief always been fraught? And this is not just about the current incumbent. It's also about his predecessor and predecessors. Relationships have always been fraught. Why do you think so?
You know, I think that actually, by and large, relations are very smooth and cooperative. But I do think that, you know, in a sense, the system is set up for some inherent tension. I mean, it's in the nature of the beast. You know, if one institution of government has one objective and another institution has more than one objective, sometimes there are going to be tensions between those objectives. And therefore, you know, so it's not peculiar. And I think that tension is probably even desirable and necessary to some extent, because that's what generates the discussion as to, you know, what is good policy. And then, you know, you kind of discuss that and come towards something that's reasonable. So I wouldn't place too much kind of emphasis on the fact of, you know, it's I think intrinsic to this business.
What is government thinking of doing to stimulate growth in the exports, given that China has already created, if you see their growth in the last 10 years, through, you know, stimulating growth by way of export promotion. And Chinese companies are keeping just-in-time inventory all over the world. And funding is done by the companies, and here we have to, you know, bring in the money within 90 days and all that. Is government thinking in this regard?
I happen to hold the view that if you want to get double-digit growth, you know, our exports have to grow rapidly. You know, if you take our, you know, this was true of the East Asian tigers, but even our own experience in the years that we grew rapidly, our services exports grew at about 25+% annually in dollar terms, and our manufacturing also grew at around 20 to 22%. So I am of the view that you cannot get double-digit growth based on the domestic market alone. So a point very well taken. The second point, I think, is that in the last couple of years, in fact, after the global financial crisis, mostly, you know, world markets have been down tremendously. So in that market, to assume that you're going to get 20-25% growth is kind of somewhat unrealistic. But I think the government is extremely acutely aware of the need for exports. And in fact, I would argue that, you know, the package on clothing that we passed, you know, a couple of months ago was actually, you know, based on an analysis which said, you know, clothing is a very important sector for a number of reasons. Exports, creating jobs, very labor intensive, and creates female jobs, women jobs. 80% people working in garment factories are women. So it's really very attractive. And at this stage, China is actually becoming uncompetitive. You know, it's vacating that space. So we have to move in to kind of occupy that space. So, you know, it's that analysis and that kind of concern with exports that led to this, you know, really big package for clothing that we're doing. We're thinking of, you know, doing similar things for other sectors as well. But I think that, you know, the broad objective that we need to focus on exports is I think, you know, something that's shared within government very, very strongly.
Since you talked about governments, I have to tell you that a good example of how politicians get it. A politician as sort of basic as Mr. Chautala, who's now serving a 10-year jail sentence, but really a politician that in the Hindi heartland would be described as dharti se jude hue. He once said to me when he was chief minister, he said, ये सारी IT की कंपनीज आ रही हैं, अच्छी तो बहुत लगती हैं, लेकिन नौकरी नहीं है. मुझे कोई बड़ी 2-3 गारमेंट के लगा दे जहां 50,000 को नौकरी मिल जाए हरियाणा के लड़के लड़कियों को.
Exactly, that's right.
So even they get it.
So in fact, in the last 2 days, I think Mr. Chandrababu Naidu opened a number of clothing factories. I think Mr. Nitish Kumar in Bihar is also, you know, I know a big textile delegation went there and they're really focusing on this. So I think, you know, I think if we can occupy some of these labor-intensive sectors, because remember, I think people forget that in some ways the history of our economic development made us kind of miss the boat on many of these things. So we're trying to make up for that lost time as well.
what is the implications of the GST on the entertainment industry, which is very, very service heavy?
Here, let me be a little bit provocative. And, I think when we think about sectors in India, whether it's health, education, we kind of worry about. I think the entertainment sector is kind of one of the last sectors that I would think needs any kind of, government assistance or help. It's such a vibrant sector. There's so much demand for it. It's so much on autopilot that if the entertainment sector were to say, give us special assistance, then I would really start worrying about the Indian economy.
Adi, please pitch in for your entertainment sector. This is Bombay versus Delhi. What do these guys know?
I think we'll have to, generally the only concern on the GST is as the tax on services might go up. But with that, the states will get tremendous additional revenue. So clearly, if not right away, in a short period of time, they will think of reducing the general rate of GST. And that could benefit society as well as the economy tremendously.